3 feet of stolen dirt destroyed an $18 million neighborhood. Those were the first words I said when the county investigator finally asked how an ordinary backyard dispute had turned into the biggest property lawsuit our valley had seen in decades. Nobody laughed anymore. They had laughed a few months earlier. They laughed while crystal glasses clinked beside a brand new infinity pool. They laughed while a drone floated overhead filming a luxury backyard reveal. They laughed because they thought I was just the quiet guy next door wearing muddy work boots and driving an old blue Ford pickup that rattled every time it climbed the hill. The smell of fresh concrete drifted across my fence before sunrise that morning. The sharp whine of tile saws echoed through the valley. Wet cement reflected the early light like polished glass. I stood at my property marker holding a faded survey map that my grandfather had folded so many times the edges felt as soft as cloth. One corner of that sparkling new pool stretched 3 feet across my property line. 3 feet. That was all. I walked over before the workers packed up. Victoria Langford stood beside the water with a glass of sparkling cider in one hand and a smile that looked more expensive than friendly. She owned the largest house on the ridge. She sold luxury real estate. She loved reminding everyone that appearances created value. I pointed toward the survey marker buried beneath fresh landscaping stone. I kept my voice calm. I told her the pool crossed onto my land. She barely looked. She smiled at her guests, instead. Then she shrugged and said, "Nobody's going to miss 3 feet." A few people chuckled. Someone raised a toast. Another guest told me not to ruin such a beautiful afternoon over a technicality. I simply folded the survey back into my jacket. I nodded once. Then I walked home without another word. They mistook silence for surrender. That was their first mistake. What none of them knew was that my family had owned far more than the narrow strip beneath that pool. Long before those luxury homes covered the hillside, my grandfather helped design the valley's original drainage system. Every retention basin, every overflow channel, every protected easement, every legal water route recorded long before any mansion existed. Those dusty records were still valid. They were still enforceable. And they were locked inside a fireproof cabinet sitting quietly in my basement. I spent the rest of that evening listening to frogs calling from the old wetlands beyond my fence while party music echoed from Victoria's backyard. The cool breeze carried the scent of chlorine 1 minute and damp earth the next. I remember smiling when I heard ducks landing somewhere beyond the reeds. At the time it sounded ordinary. Months later that sound would become the soundtrack of Victoria's complete financial collapse. All because she decided that 3 feet of someone else's land wasn't worth asking permission for. My name is Daniel Mercer. I am 45 years old. Most people in Cedar Ridge knew me as the quiet man at the end of the road. They waved when they drove by. They never stopped to ask what I actually did. That suited me just fine. My mornings usually began before sunrise with a cup of black coffee on the back porch. The air always smelled like wet grass and pine after the sprinklers finished their cycle. Songbirds filled the trees behind my house long before the neighborhood came alive. It was the kind of peaceful routine that money could never buy. My father used to tell me that land remembers every person who respects it. My grandfather believed the same thing. He bought our property shortly after returning from military service in the late 1940s. Back then this entire valley was open farmland with creeks winding through rolling hills. There were no luxury homes. No stone entrance signs. No homeowners association meetings. There was only honest work and a careful understanding of how water moved across the land. He worked alongside county engineers to build drainage channels that protected farms during heavy storms. Every ditch, every overflow route, every easement was surveyed, documented, and recorded with the county. Those papers were treated like family heirlooms. While other children inherited baseball cards or old watches, I inherited maps. Covered in faded pencil marks and handwritten notes. My grandfather made me study every one of them. He never raised his voice. He simply smiled and said that one day those papers would matter more than gold. At the time I thought he was exaggerating. Years later, I realized he had been preparing me for a problem that had not even been invented yet. I studied civil engineering in college because I genuinely loved solving practical problems. I spent 2 decades designing stormwater systems, flood control projects, and environmental restoration plans throughout the state. My work kept me behind blueprints instead of cameras. That was exactly how I preferred it. A few years before all this happened, my business partners retired. They sold me their shares. I quietly became the majority owner of Mercer Environmental Holdings. Our company managed restoration contracts, conservation easements, and water infrastructure across several counties. The company was worth far more than anyone in the neighborhood imagined. I never felt the need to advertise it. My old pickup still ran perfectly. My work boots were comfortable. I saw no reason to replace either one. Meanwhile, the houses around me kept getting larger every year. Luxury gates appeared. Landscaping crews arrived every Tuesday. Expensive outdoor kitchens replaced vegetable gardens. Neighbors competed over who could install the most impressive backyard features. I stayed out of those competitions. The only improvements I cared about were maintaining healthy trees, restoring native grasses, and protecting the small wetland behind my property. Every spring, wild ducks returned to nest there. Their quiet calls echoed across the reeds at sunset. My grandfather loved those birds. He always said that if ducks trusted your land, you were doing something right. I thought about those words often, especially after Victoria moved in next door. She looked at every square foot of land as something to improve, market, and increase in value. I looked at the same ground and saw history. That difference seemed harmless in the beginning. I had no idea it would eventually divide an entire community and expose secrets buried beneath. Perfectly manicured lawns for more than 70 years. Victoria Langford arrived the following spring with moving trucks that looked more like a commercial production than a family relocation. The deep rumble of diesel engines echoed through the valley from sunrise until late afternoon. Workers unloaded marble planters, designer patio furniture, imported palm trees, even decorative stone that had traveled farther than most people in the neighborhood ever would. Every delivery seemed designed to make a statement. She was 52 years old. Always perfectly dressed. Always carrying the latest phone. Always speaking loudly enough for nearby neighbors to hear. She introduced herself as one of the most successful luxury real estate brokers in the county. Within a month, she was hosting evening gatherings around her backyard fire pit. Every conversation somehow circled back to property values. She spoke about houses the way some people spoke about stock portfolios. To Victoria, every home was an investment. Every tree was either an asset or an obstacle. Every neighbor was measured by the effect they had on resale prices. She never seemed interested in learning the history of the valley. She only cared about what could be built next. The first time she walked onto my property happened so casually that I almost ignored it. I looked up from trimming native grass along the fence and saw her examining one of my old survey markers. She tapped it with the toe of an expensive white shoe before smiling. She asked whether I had ever considered straightening my property line because she thought the curve looked awkward from her upstairs balcony. I laughed politely because I assumed she was joking. She was not. A week later she appeared again holding architectural drawings rolled beneath one arm. The paper smelled fresh from the printer. She spread the plans across the hood of her luxury sport utility vehicle and pointed toward the back corner where our properties met. She explained that her landscape architect wanted to create the perfect infinity pool with an uninterrupted mountain view. The only problem was that my property line interrupted the symmetry of her design. She suggested that I sell her a narrow strip of land. She described it as insignificant. Only a few feet wide. Barely noticeable. I thanked her for the offer and declined. I explained that the boundary had remained unchanged for more than 70 years because it followed an original drainage easement. She smiled without really listening. Then she said something that stayed with me long after she drove away. She said old paperwork should never stand in the way of modern living. Over the next several weeks, survey crews appeared again and again near the shared boundary. Bright orange flags moved a few inches at a time. Wooden stakes disappeared overnight and reappeared somewhere else the next morning. Fresh paint marks covered rocks that had never been touched before. I quietly photographed everything. Not because I expected a fight. Years of engineering had simply taught me that records matter more than arguments. One afternoon I noticed two construction supervisors studying my fence instead of hers. I walked over and asked whether they needed anything. One of them glanced toward Victoria before answering. He admitted that the final design had changed several times because the owner wanted a cleaner visual line. His expression told me more than his words ever could. Someone was trying to make the boundary disappear without officially moving it. The smell of fresh spray paint lingered in the warm air after they left. I knelt beside the old brass survey cap my grandfather had installed decades earlier. Dirt brushed away easily beneath my fingertips. The marker had not moved an inch. The land had not changed. Only the ambition of the person standing next door had changed. That was when I realized this was never about building a beautiful backyard. It was about proving that enough confidence and enough money could rewrite lines that had been respected for generations. Construction officially began on a cool Monday morning. The steady growl of excavators rolled across the valley before the sun cleared the hills. Diesel fumes mixed with the smell of freshly turned soil. I watched from my porch while workers unloaded steel forms and pallets of stone tile. Everything moved with military precision. Every truck arrived on schedule. Every crew knew exactly where to go. At least that was what they believed. By noon I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The original survey stakes had disappeared. New wooden stakes stood several feet deeper onto my side of the property. They were bright orange instead of weathered brown. Fresh hammer marks covered the tops. Someone had not simply measured incorrectly. Someone had replaced the boundary. I walked over carrying a copy of the certified survey folded inside a waterproof tube. The site supervisor wiped concrete dust from his gloves before looking at the papers. He compared my map with the construction drawings in his truck. His face changed almost immediately. He quietly admitted the two property lines did not match. Before he could say anything else, Victoria appeared wearing sunglasses and spotless white sneakers that somehow never touched the mud. She smiled as though we were discussing flower beds instead of legal boundaries. She told the supervisor to keep working because her architect had already verified everything. I calmly asked which survey company had approved moving a recorded property line. She answered with a confident laugh. She said modern satellite measurements were more accurate than old county records. I explained that county records created ownership. Satellites only measured it. She rolled her eyes and looked back at the workers. Then she said something that several people standing nearby clearly heard. She said nobody was going to stop an entire luxury project over 3 useless feet of dirt. The workers hesitated. Then they continued pouring concrete. I documented every stage with my phone. The sound of rebar clanging against steel echoed through the afternoon, while wet concrete slowly spread across ground my grandfather had protected for decades. They removed 2 mature native shrubs without asking. They cut through a shallow drainage swale that carried stormwater during heavy rain. It looked insignificant unless you understood hydrology. To everyone else it appeared to be nothing more than a shallow depression in the grass. To me it was part of a system that had quietly protected this hillside for generations. I drove into town that evening and requested updated copies of every recorded easement affecting my property. The clerk recognized my family name immediately. She disappeared into the archive room and returned with a stack of aging documents tied together by faded blue ribbon. The paper smelled like old books and dry cedar shelves. Every page confirmed exactly what my grandfather had taught me. Nothing had ever been abandoned. Nothing had expired. Every drainage right remained active. Every conservation restriction remained enforceable. I placed the documents back into their envelope and drove home under a sky turning deep orange. Across the fence the outline of Victoria's infinity pool was already visible beneath temporary work lights. Guests walked through the construction site taking photographs as if the project had already become a neighborhood landmark. They admired the mountain view. They complimented the design. None of them noticed the narrow strip of ground beneath the fresh concrete. None of them understood that the smallest part of the project was about to become the most expensive mistake that any of them would ever remember. The next morning I made exactly one phone call. Not to a lawyer. Not to the county. Not to the homeowners association. I called an independent licensed surveyor whose family had been measuring property boundaries in this county for nearly 60 years. By noon his crew arrived with professional equipment mounted on bright yellow tripods. The soft electronic beeps drifted across the hillside while neighbors slowed their cars to watch. Victoria stepped outside carrying an iced coffee and wearing the same confident smile she always seemed to have whenever someone questioned her decisions. She walked over and asked whether I was finally ready to admit the project was legal. I smiled politely and told her I only wanted accurate measurements. She laughed loud enough for several workers to hear. She said I was wasting my money because expensive attorneys had already reviewed everything. I never argued. I simply thanked the survey crew for their time and walked back inside. 2 hours later, the lead surveyor knocked on my door. He quietly confirmed exactly what I already knew. The pool crossed onto my property by 3 feet and 4 inches. The retaining wall also blocked part of the historic drainage easement. He offered to prepare a certified report immediately. I accepted and paid the invoice before sunset. The report went into my fireproof cabinet beside my grandfather's original maps. I did nothing else. Days turned into weeks. The construction continued without interruption. Massive stone pavers arrived. Outdoor lighting was installed. Exotic landscaping covered the disturbed ground. Every evening I could hear the splash of workers testing the circulation system. The faint smell of chlorine floated across the fence whenever the breeze shifted toward my porch. Several neighbors stopped by to ask why I had gone so quiet. One of them even suggested I had finally realized that fighting wealthy people never ended well. I only smiled and changed the subject. Silence has a strange effect on confident people. They mistake it for surrender. Victoria certainly did. She began acting as though the disputed land had always belonged to her. She instructed her landscaping crew to trim bushes several feet inside my side of the boundary. Decorative lights appeared along the edge of my grass without permission. Guests wandered across the property line during weekend gatherings without realizing they had left her yard. I photographed everything. Every light fixture. Every new stone. Every footprint. Every delivery. My phone slowly filled with hundreds of carefully organized images. Each file carried a date and time stamp. Years of engineering had taught me that facts become powerful when they are collected patiently instead of emotionally. Then came the invitation that surprised everyone. Victoria mailed elegant cards to nearly every homeowner in the neighborhood announcing the official grand opening of her luxury backyard retreat. The celebration would include live music, catered food, and a drone photography company filming the event from above. She even bragged in the neighborhood newsletter that her new pool would increase property values throughout the entire subdivision. Reading those words made me smile for the first time in weeks. She believed the project was finished. She believed every important decision had already been made. She believed my quiet acceptance meant the problem had disappeared. Standing on my porch that evening, I listened to frogs calling from the old wetland beyond the trees. A pair of mallards landed gently on the water as the last light faded behind the hills. Their soft calls echoed through the cool evening air. My grandfather used to say that nature always remembers the path people try to erase. Looking at those ducks, I realized my response would not begin in a courtroom. It would begin exactly where the land had always wanted the water to return. The morning after Victoria's celebration, I unlocked the old fireproof cabinet in my basement for the first time in years. The heavy steel door groaned open with the same familiar sound I remembered from childhood. Inside sat dozens of rolled maps tied with faded cloth ribbons. Survey books filled one shelf. Leather binders covered another. Every page carried my grandfather's careful handwriting beside official county stamps. The paper smelled dry and slightly sweet with age. I spread the oldest map across my workbench. My fingers stopped on a date from 1948. That single document changed everything. It showed the original drainage network that protected the entire valley long before the first subdivision existed. Every easement was recorded. Every overflow channel was measured. Every conservation restriction had been renewed through later agreements. The narrow strip beneath Victoria's new pool was never just empty ground. It was part of a protected drainage corridor connected to the natural wetland behind my property. That afternoon I drove to the county archives instead of the courthouse. The records manager greeted me by name because my engineering company had worked with the county for years on restoration projects. She retrieved several sealed files that had not been opened in decades. One by one we compared every survey. Every easement remained active. Every maintenance obligation remained enforceable. Nothing had expired. Nothing had been abandoned. The legal chain was complete. I quietly requested certified copies of every document. The stack became nearly 3 inches thick. Before leaving, I also requested historical aerial photographs dating back more than 70 years. They clearly showed the original wetland extending across the same corner where Victoria's contractors had poured concrete. Driving home, I stopped at my office instead of my house. Most of my neighbors believed I spent my days inspecting drainage ditches for local contractors. Very few knew the building carried the name Mercer Environmental Holdings across the front entrance. Even fewer knew I owned the company. Our engineers specialized in watershed restoration, environmental compliance, and conservation easements throughout several counties. I called a meeting with my senior staff. They expected another routine infrastructure project. Instead, I rolled my grandfather's map across the conference table. The room became completely silent. My chief hydrologist studied the survey for several minutes before looking up. He quietly confirmed what I already suspected. The drainage corridor had been obstructed. The wetland connection had been interrupted. The original environmental design could legally be restored if all permits were properly obtained. That sentence stayed in my mind all evening. Restored. Not altered. Not invented. Restored. There was an enormous legal difference. Over the following week, I submitted applications to restore the historic wetland exactly as documented in county records. Every drawing matched the original surveys. Every environmental study supported the plan. Every permit request followed existing regulations. No shortcuts. No favors. No special treatment. Just paperwork supported by facts older than the neighborhood itself. Then I ordered something that puzzled everyone in my office. I asked a local wildlife supplier about native aquatic plants suitable for shallow ponds. I contacted a conservation group about relocating rescued mallards after the restoration was complete. My assistant looked confused and asked why ducks suddenly mattered in the middle of a property dispute. I simply smiled. My grandfather always said that healthy wetlands invite ducks long before they attract lawyers. As I stood on my back porch that evening, the breeze carried faint laughter from another gathering at Victoria's house. Music drifted across the fence beside the smell of chlorine and expensive barbecue. Beyond the trees, I heard the quiet splash of wild ducks settling into the remaining marsh. I looked toward the corner where her perfect infinity pool crossed onto protected ground. For the first time since construction began, I was no longer thinking about 3 feet of stolen land. I was thinking about restoring an entire ecosystem that the law had never stopped protecting. County approval arrived on a quiet Thursday morning. The envelope was plain. The paper inside was not. Every permit had been signed. Every environmental review had been completed. Every restoration plan matched the historical records exactly as they had existed for generations. I placed the documents back into their folder and drove home without telling a single neighbor. The following Monday, a different kind of construction crew rolled into my driveway. Their trucks carried native reeds instead of marble tile. Their trailers held young willow trees instead of imported palm trees. Small excavators arrived with low ground pressure tracks designed to protect sensitive soil. The operators moved slowly and carefully. There was no loud celebration. No drone cameras. No champagne. Only the steady rhythm of skilled people restoring something that had quietly waited decades for permission to return. Victoria noticed before lunchtime. She walked across the grass wearing another immaculate white outfit that stood out against the fresh earth. She demanded to know what I thought I was doing. I handed her a copy of the restoration permit without saying another word. She scanned the first page and frowned. Then she reached the county seal. Her confident smile disappeared for the first time since she had moved into the neighborhood. She insisted I was ruining property values. I calmly explained that I was restoring protected wetlands under existing environmental regulations. She argued that nobody wanted a marsh beside luxury homes. I answered that the county records disagreed with her opinion. Within days, shallow channels were carefully reopened exactly where the original surveys showed they had once existed. Native grasses replaced decorative stone. Rain gardens connected to the restored drainage corridor. The entire project remained completely inside my property and entirely within the approved easement. Every afternoon the sound of flowing water grew a little stronger as the system slowly returned to life. Then the ducks arrived. At first there were only 4 mallards circling above the new pond at sunrise. By the end of the second week there were dozens. Their quiet calls echoed across the valley from dawn until dusk. Dragonflies appeared. Frogs returned. Great blue herons occasionally landed near the deeper water. Children from neighboring streets stopped with their parents to watch the wildlife from the public trail outside the subdivision. Local bird photographers began visiting on weekend mornings. The place felt alive again. Victoria saw something entirely different. She saw guests canceling pool parties because the peaceful silence she had promised in glossy invitations no longer existed. She complained about duck calls during homeowners association meetings. She complained about natural vegetation that blocked part of her mountain view. She complained about birds resting near her expensive stone patio. Every complaint ended the same way. County officials politely reminded her that the restoration had been fully approved and complied with every environmental regulation on record. Frustrated, she hired an attorney. The attorney requested copies of every permit, every survey, every easement, every historical map. Weeks later, his office quietly withdrew every objection after discovering the legal documentation reached back more than 70 years without interruption. That was when the first real consequences appeared. Insurance inspectors reviewing nearby properties noticed the newly documented drainage corridor. Mortgage companies requested updated environmental disclosures. Potential buyers began asking uncomfortable questions about structures built too close to protected easements. Suddenly, the conversation across the neighborhood was no longer about luxury landscaping. It was about compliance. Standing beside the pond one cool evening, I watched another flock of ducks glide across the calm water while the setting sun reflected in gentle ripples. Across the fence, Victoria stared at the same scene with disbelief. She still thought this was about birds. She still believed I had built a pond to annoy her. She had not yet realized the pond was only the visible reminder of something far larger. The real storm was moving through paperwork instead of clouds. And it had only just begun. The first certified letter arrived exactly 19 days after the wetland restoration was completed. It was not addressed to me. It was addressed to Victoria. Then another letter appeared. Then another. The county planning office requested additional documentation for structures built inside the protected drainage corridor. The Environmental Compliance Division requested engineering certifications. The insurance company requested updated flood risk evaluations. The mortgage lender ordered an independent property review before renewing the existing financing package. None of those organizations were working together. They were simply responding to the same public records that had existed for decades. The restoration project had brought those records back into plain sight. Victoria tried to convince everyone that I had created the problem. Unfortunately for her, every official document carried dates that were much older than either of us. My grandfather's surveys had been recorded before her neighborhood even existed. The sound of printers running inside county offices became far more dangerous than any courtroom argument. Every new report pointed to the same conclusion. Her luxury pool partially occupied protected property and interfered with a recorded drainage easement. That finding triggered another review. Then another. Soon engineers inspected neighboring lots built by the same developer years earlier. Several decorative retaining walls crossed protected utility corridors. Expensive landscape features blocked historical drainage routes. A few backyard additions had never received the proper environmental approvals at all. One discovery quietly unlocked another. What began as a dispute over 3 feet of land became a complete audit of the subdivision. Neighbors who had laughed during Victoria's grand opening suddenly stood in line requesting copies of their own surveys. Real estate agents canceled open houses after buyers asked difficult questions about environmental disclosures. 2 pending home sales collapsed before closing because lenders demanded additional legal reviews. Property values froze almost overnight while inspectors completed their reports. Victoria's attorney finally requested a private meeting. We sat across a polished conference table overlooking the restored pond. Through the windows I could hear ducks calling across the water while tall reeds moved gently in the breeze. He placed a thick folder in front of me and asked whether I would consider a settlement. I listened without interrupting. He offered to purchase the disputed strip of land for several times its market value. He offered to rebuild my fence. He even offered to fund conservation projects of my choosing. When he finished speaking, I quietly slid one document across the table. It was not a demand for money. It was the original 1948 drainage easement signed by my grandfather and the county. Attached behind it were the current restoration permits and the certified survey proving the encroachment. I explained that this had never been about selling land. It had always been about protecting it. His shoulders dropped before he slowly closed the folder. He understood the difference immediately. A few weeks later, the county issued its formal determination. The encroaching portion of the pool would have to be removed to restore full compliance with the recorded easement. The decision also required additional engineering work throughout the subdivision to ensure the historic drainage network remained functional. Contractors estimated the combined corrections would cost many millions of dollars. Insurance policies covered only a fraction because the structures had been built. Contrary to recorded property restrictions, the developer faced lawsuits from homeowners. Homeowners questioned the homeowners association. Financial institutions demanded corrective action before approving future transactions. Standing on my porch one cool autumn evening, I watched trucks carrying survey equipment roll through the neighborhood again. This time nobody laughed when they saw bright orange markers being placed in the ground. Everyone finally understood that property lines are not suggestions. They are promises recorded in ink long before anyone decides to ignore them. Winter arrived quietly. The restored wetland looked nothing like the muddy construction site people had mocked only a few months earlier. Frost shimmered across the reeds each morning. Thin layers of mist drifted above the calm water before sunrise. Mallards floated peacefully beside the cattails while great blue herons stood perfectly still along the shoreline. The gentle sound of moving water replaced the endless noise of construction equipment that had once filled the valley. I sat on my back porch with a hot cup of coffee almost every morning. The smell of cedar mixed with cool air reminded me of the mornings I had shared with my grandfather decades earlier. He had always believed that land rewarded patience. Looking across the pond, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Victoria's property looked very different now. The section of the pool that crossed onto protected ground had been removed under county supervision. Engineers redesigned the remaining structure to comply with every recorded easement. Heavy equipment returned one last time. This time it was not building something larger. It was correcting something that should never have been built that way in the first place. The luxury magazine that had once featured her backyard quietly removed the online article. The real estate advertisements disappeared. The endless weekend parties stopped. A moving truck eventually backed into her driveway one gray afternoon. Workers carefully loaded furniture into trailers without music or celebration. Nobody gathered to watch. Nobody applauded. The neighborhood had learned enough. Lessons already? Several months later, a young family purchased the house. Before signing the closing documents, they walked over and introduced themselves. They asked whether there was anything they should know about the shared property line. I smiled and invited them to look at the original survey maps. We spent nearly an hour studying the old records together. They thanked me for explaining the history instead of hiding it. Before leaving, they promised they wanted to be good neighbors first and homeowners second. That conversation meant far more to me than winning any legal dispute ever could. The restored wetlands soon became part of a local conservation education program. Elementary school students visited every spring to observe native birds and learn why natural drainage systems mattered. Environmental science classes from nearby colleges occasionally conducted field studies along the shoreline. Children laughed whenever ducklings followed their mothers through the shallow water. Parents took photographs from the observation path. Nobody complained about the sound of ducks anymore. Those gentle calls had become part of the character of the valley. One afternoon, a county commissioner stopped by after attending a restoration conference. He shook my hand and thanked me for preserving a piece of local history that almost disappeared beneath decorative concrete. He admitted the project had inspired several nearby communities to review their own historical easements before approving new developments. Hearing that meant more than any financial settlement could have. My grandfather's old maps had protected far more than my property. They had reminded an entire county that records exist for a reason. Sometimes the strongest foundations are the ones nobody notices until someone tries to erase them. Every evening I still walk the edge of the pond before sunset. I stop beside the old brass survey marker that never moved an inch through all the years of arguments, construction, and legal paperwork. I brush away a little dirt with my boot and smile every time I see it. 3 feet of land never made anyone rich. But respecting those 3 feet protected generations of history, restored an entire ecosystem, and reminded a neighborhood that true ownership is never measured by confidence or money. It is measured by integrity. Justice never needed raised voices. It never needed revenge driven by anger. It only needed patience, facts, and the quiet certainty that the truth has a way of flowing back to where it has always belonged.